Hi, everybody. Welcome to Wondrous Sites. So we're looking at a wide spread of time and places here. So I wanted to focus on a handful of locations that inspire wonder in the people who go there, who went there at the times that we're looking, and still when you visit them today, it gives you a sense of enormity, of some sort of cosmic connection with the other world, whether that's heaven, whether that's some sort of afterlife. And so we'll be looking at these within the context of how the monuments and the architecture itself can communicate this sense of wonder. For today, you'll have read 3 chapters. Chapter 12, one of 3 chapters, sorry. Early Mesopotamian art, chapter 16, Buddhist and Hindu art in South and Southeast Asia, and chapter 17, Villanovan and Etruscan art. So we'll be taking one from each chapter today. So here are the areas that we'll be looking at, specifically with regard to the spread of Buddhism in Southeast Asia here, coming out of this area and making quite a quick and very widespread expansion. I've added this even though we won't be talking about Hinduism, just to kind of give you a little bit of comparison. And then we'll be moving, not in this order, to Italy, where we'll be looking at the Etruscans who are living here in the northwestern coast on the Tyrrhenian Sea. And we will also be popping by Teotihuacan, which is near modern day Mexico City. And we will be looking at the complex built there. Okay, so we'll start here in Mexico. We're in the Common Era, so just keep an eye on the BCEs and the CEs because we're jumping around a lot. This is Teotihuacan, and this is the largest metropolis at its time, more or less. It is arranged on an axis. So it has a north-south main street called the Street of the Dead. And at the north end of this, we have the Temple of the Moon or the Pyramid of the Moon. And at the south end, we have the tomb or pyramid of the Feathered Serpent, which we'll look at in more detail. So this was one of the chief cities. That's what a metropolitan means, or metropolis, in Mesoamerica around central Mexico. As we saw, this is an enormous civilization. At its height around 400, there were something like 250,000 people who lived in this site. So that's really rivaling the other largest cities at its time. And so you can see here the orientation of the main street and the cross street. And around these monumental pyramid structures, there are about 2,000 other residential buildings. So we know that this is a really bustling place that probably had markets and religious festivals and all kinds of things like that. But we don't really know anything about the people who lived here. What we do know comes centuries later when the Aztecs look at this place that has been abandoned since and kind of create their own history based on what they find here. And so our view of the people from Teotihuacan is being sort of filtered through the Aztec perspective. And of course, the Aztecs have their own cultures and religion and languages, etc. So the name itself means the place where gods are created, or the place where men become gods. And so this right away gives us a hint to this kind of wondrousness of this location. There is a link here between heaven and earth, between this life and the afterlife, even if we don't know exactly what that is. And so in the article that I've assigned you, there's some really interesting discoveries still happening today at this site. What's also important about Teotihuacan is that it was planned. So this isn't a city that just kind of popped up out of nowhere and grew organically. It's laid out on a grid system, I think one of the only ones of its kind. Even medieval cities up until the 15th, 16th century are all, discombobulated and winding, and we don't have this clean grid system. So there's a real preference for geometric and symmetrical organization here. We are very specific about where these different monuments are located, how they're oriented in the geography of the space around the city. And so there's something really purposeful, even if the inhabitants and their ways of life are still kind of a mystery. We do not have royal tombs here, although the pyramids do enclose some sacrificed human victims, which we'll get to in a moment. But what this does is it denies us any information about the political structure beyond the fact that it was clearly very well organized, right? So 2 of the temples here, Temple of the Sun on the left and the Temple of the Feathered Serpent on the right, are still today tourist locations. The Temple of the Sun is interesting because it was originally set with a canal around its base to give this kind of sense of a mountain rising out of a lake. And this is one of the examples in this area that in some sense mirror the actual environment around the built structures that we're looking at. So at 200 feet, this is the tallest structure in America at its time. It's really, really revolutionary. And it's built over a cave. And again, this gives us some sort of sense of the wonder that would be associated with this cave because, with this temple rather, this pyramid, because in the tradition that follows with the Aztecs, the cave, and actually the Mayans as well, the cave serves as sort of this like origin story location or a place where, you know, the dead are, or where, you know, transitions happen. So it's a kind of a mystical space. And so the fact that there's a cave at the base of this underneath does tell us something perhaps about its purpose. On the right, the Temple of the Feathered Serpent is named after Quetzalcoatl, who is the feathered serpent deity. This is a smaller temple, but it's much more decorated. And in 2003, they discovered some interesting things by accident, which we'll discuss shortly. So it's in this particular temple that we have the cremated remains, or the arranged sacrificed remains of 200 individuals that are divided, men and women, separately. And was curiously at the very, very bottom underneath, there seems to be some kind of recreated landscape in this temple where the lakes are actually filled with little like dowses of actual liquid mercury, which is very poisonous, never touch it. And the walls of that area are decorated with pyrite, which is known as fool's gold. And so this would give it a sense of kind of twinkling stars all around. So we don't know exactly what's going on, but clearly anyone traveling through these tunnels and emerging in this miniature landscape with fake stars twinkling all around you and these silvery lakes would feel like you're in some sort of recreation of heaven or something like that. In addition, the Pyramid of the Moon, which is at the end of the Street of the Dead, you can see also mirrors the shape of the mountain behind it. And so again, there's this reincorporation. It's almost like the city itself is the universe in miniature. And again, it's very, very highly decorated. Plenty of frescoes have survived. And so this fresco is a true fresco, which, as you know by now, means that the pigment was applied directly to the wet plaster. So you can see, 2,000 years later, this is held up very, very well. The colors are very vibrant, this red and green, and there's a sort of teal that we also see frequently in the murals from this place. And like the organization of the city itself, the mural is very geometric, very symmetrical. We can see the face of the deity. We call this the goddess mural. And on her head, she's wearing this elaborate headdress with a bird's face here and feathers and plumes coming out of the top of it. And in her hands, it seems as though she's holding something that may seem like water, streams of water by this little kind of curlicue Greek key kind of shape. And she's standing on something that actually mirrors, again, the shape of the pyramids around. So is she emerging from the pyramid? Is the base the pyramid? We're not exactly sure what to interpret this with, but what we do know is this frontal gaze gives the audience direct contact with this deity, right? You're looking into her eyes and also into the eyes of the bird on her headdress. So there's a real directional proximity happening here, this frontal view. Here on the right, we have one of the details from that Pyramid of the Feathered Serpent. This is a depiction of Quetzalcoatl, and you can just see this sort of fearsome dragon-like face carved, and he's usually carved with horizontal bands that mimic feathers. So when the tunnel was discovered, which you have ideally read about already, they sent a little rover down there to inspect, and they found, as I mentioned, this area that was this sort of little imaginary cosmology of everything with the mercury and the stars. But they also found other objects attesting to burial practices. And so one set of these are the sculptures that they discovered down there, which you can see have stood here like this for like 1,800 years. And then all of a sudden, human eyes are laid on them again for the first time. So that's a different kind of wonder, right? That archaeological discovery. But the fact that these tombs still hold so many secrets, right? Now with the excavation of these areas, maybe we'll learn more about what the people who lived here did, believed, how they, understood their life in the grander scheme of things. And just like with the Greco-Roman art, This would have been brightly colored and exuberantly pigmented. So again, this sort of brick red that we saw that was in the fresco of the goddess, but then also this teal and kind of sandstone gold colors. And then this artistic depiction. This is also clearly, a modern reconstruction. In this artistic depiction, we can see the same kind of palette. And just imagine like in a very, very sunny location, how these colors would like almost fluoresce. We move on now, way back in time to India. So we're in central India now. And I start with this picture just so that you can get a sense of approach, right? When we're in a place that inspires wonder, it's not just the structure itself, it's the way the structure interacts with the ground and the sky and the trees and the mountains and everything around it. So this approach to the stupa that we'll be looking at today gives us a sense of kind of wilderness, right? But then this thing rising above it, the structure that can be seen from afar. And so there's a sort of anticipation as you're approaching a site of wonder, right? You can see it on the distance, and as you approach, that walk towards it or carriage or whatever becomes somewhat processional. It becomes somewhat of a ritual to approach, right? And if we think about the Street of the Dead, approaching one of those pyramids, you can't help but notice where you're walking as you're walking towards this monument. So the same thing here with the stupa. Excuse me. So the stupa itself is actually a mound. So there's nothing inside it except for relics of Buddha. You can't go in it. But nevertheless, this is a sort of holy locus, a holy node, a place in the earth that can inspire religious devotion. So it was built under Ashoka. And Ashoka was an emperor who was the first to adopt and promulgate Buddhism. So Buddhism, obviously named after the Buddha Siddhartha Gautama, who in the 6th century, before the Common Era, achieved the state of enlightenment, the state of nirvana, and established a religion that would be in pursuit of what he called the Four Noble Truths. And this is the effort to bring yourself happiness by getting rid of desire. That's what's at the heart of this. And so these stupas would be places where you could go to be in the presence of relics of the Buddha after his death, but they were also places that prompted you to confront your Buddhist faith. And there are a couple of elements that I want to point out that we'll look at in more detail. The main one being the Torana here. And so this is a sort of gate post or an entryway kind of post, pillars that would mark the entryway. And in this particular case, there's one for each of the cardinal directions, north, south, east, and west. So this particular one being built at the same time, remember from last week that Alexander the Great is carrying out his, major campaigns, within about 50 years of that. This particular site is made to prompt what we call circumambulation, and this is walking around. Circumambulation is a way to kind of get into a zone by just walking the prescribed path that is shown for you. And we see this also, for example, in Christian monasteries. We see this in the Muslim Hajj to the Great Mosque in Mecca, where you walk to stimulate and generate sacred energy, prayer, meditation, etc. And so that's certainly the case here. You would enter, and then there's a little kind of pathway that you can walk around with a little ramp. So this would be something that you would do before you would sit down to meditate or before you would get into your prayers. So the place is heavily carved. There's a number of structures. These are not from the same stupa that I just showed you. They're from a different one, but nevertheless, we have this ever-present lotus flower, which is very integral to Buddhist iconography. And then we have what I just thought was an interesting one, a woman who's actually riding a centaur, so a half person, half horse kind of mythological creature. The carvings that we see on the Torana are in relief. So they're carved. This is a much deeper relief than the bas relief, the low relief that we normally see. This is more high relief. So there's going to be more distance between the surface and then the backdrop. And this scene is a scene of Buddha departing. And although Buddha himself is not depicted here, we can see these parasols that represent his authority. And this is a scene of continuous narration, which we've already encountered. So in other words, we're watching a scene as it progresses, and the same characters might show up multiple times in the scene. For example, this horse that belongs to Buddha appearing 3 separate times. And what you're seeing here is actually a bevy of different gods lifting up the horse so that the horse's feet don't make a sound as the Buddha is leaving the city. So as continuous narration, this gives us a story to follow. And so the art at these places of wonder can be read, right? It's not like you just go there and you do your walk and you're done. There's all kinds of things to look at and appreciate and to marvel at the skill of the sculptors producing this highly condensed, yet still very readable scene. Finally, on the other part of the Eastern Gate, and you can see what we were just looking at right up here, and see there's just detail everywhere. Look at the plumes here on this feather, the elephant's headdresses. I mean, it's exquisite. Spirals. But here we see a figure that might seem a bit incongruous at this holy site. And so this stupa was built at the site of a major monastery for Buddhism. And the monks clearly were just like, you know, our general interpretation of monks is that they were supposed to be celibate. Nevertheless, we have this quite busty figurine here, and she is actually an earth spirit of fertility. So this is a Yakshi figure, and her fertility is reflected in the fact that she's very voluptuous. She's got a small waist but very big hips, etc. And her purpose is to kind of spring things into being, creation, fecundity. And so she's often depicted so that if she would put her foot on something, plants would sprout out of it. And so here we have her hanging out of a mango tree, kind of off of this lintel next to this capital on top of the pillar. And she has this very sinuous pose, her arm linked into the tree here, and then just fruit piling up in the treetop here. One other aspect of this site at Sanchi, where the great stupa is the existence of a pillar. Now, unfortunately, the particular pillar at this site does not exist anymore. It's been knocked down and broken into pieces. You can still see the base of it, but it's not as impressive as the pillar of Ashoka here at Vaishali, also in India. But these pillars were ways that Emperor Ashoka could communicate and show his prowess and his strength. So there are pillars kind of all over the region that he ruled, many of them still standing, extremely heavy, extremely impressive structures. Like if we think about those Egyptian obelisks, this would be similar. And they're capped with capitals. So the capitals typically have a lotus flower and then some sort of base, which is sometimes a wheel shape, like as though it could spin. The wheel is a very important concept in Buddhism. And then an animal at the top. So in a lot of cases, we see lions, and this is partly because a lion is a symbol of royalty, but also because Buddha is associated with a lion due to a nickname. He was called the lion of his clan. And so ultimately, the single lion that you see at this particular pillar becomes the 4-part lion. So we've got 4 lions with all of their backs pressed together, looking at the cardinal directions. And we can see that they have very stylized fur, these very elegant, like weighty, grimacing heads, very detailed paws here with, you can actually see claws. And then in this particular one, from the area where the Great Stupa is, we can see that there are little birds and little floral motifs down here. And then we've got the inverted lotus. Interestingly, so this is a recreation. We have the real thing, but it's very damaged. This would have been on top like that. And when we look at this carving, also from Sanchi, we can see our pillar, our capital here, with a wheel on top. And so it's purported that this originally would have had some sort of wheel motif, some sort of sun wheel, something like that above it. So it's kind of interesting to see the art reflected in the contemporary art that's like right next to it at the same site. So the particular pillar that we see here had an edict on it, and over 19 of these edicts have survived. And an edict is sort of an official proclamation. This one happens to be about scolding monks who are trying to break out from a specific Buddhist sect. So in all of this iconography, the lion, the height, something that, again, that you'd see from afar, the skillfulness of the artist, all of this would speak not only to Ashoka's own power, but also to Buddha's power, and would unite those two in this expression of authority. Again, inspiring wonder with how kind of unique these would be in a landscape. Moving now to Italy, we're with our lovely Etruscan culture, even further back in time. I should have done these in the other order, but C'est la vie. And we're at the Banditaccia necropolis in Cerveteri, Italy. So we're up in that northwestern corner on the Tyrrhenian Sea, and we are in a necropolis. So as you remember from our previous use of this word, this is a city of the dead. And what you're looking at here are tumuli, singular tumulus. So these huge mounds enclose tombs. The largest one, I think, is 130 feet in diameter. So this is enormous. This is actually a city-sized location, right? City for the dead, but as though the dead were still living and still present. And so again, this communication between the spirit world and the concrete world. So the Etruscans are a people that, as you saw, were in the upper northwest corner of Italy. They predated the Roman Empire. And so they, in some ways, truly, truly inspired Roman styles and Roman culture, but in some ways they were still strange. We haven't quite figured out the Etruscans. And one of the reasons for this is that they speak a language that is not Indo-European. So when we think about the vast majority of other languages in the Western Hemisphere, these are coming from a common ancient ancestor, a sort of Indo-European moment that then bifurcates into all of these different branches and gives us all of our different languages. But the Etruscans speak something different, like the Basque people today between Spain and France. So the Etruscans were known for their art. They were known for being very good at metallurgy, so metalworking and sculpture. And they had a lot of communication with other peoples around them, namely the Greeks who we met last week, and also the Phoenicians, who were a seafaring people coming out of Carthage and the North African coast. We do know from these burial mounds that the Etruscans had a very stratified society. So in other words, everyone had a location in the sort of hierarchy or the ladder of social order. Unfortunately, we don't have any significant written texts from them. So what we do know about them is coming almost exclusively from something like archaeology. So here in this particular necropolis, there are thousands, plural, of tombs. And this is, I mean, a tremendously fascinating site. And I mean, just, you could see why something like this would inspire, like, you know, the Hobbit's Shire, right? This is a very sort of engaging juxtaposition of like man-made life, but in a natural sense here, all covered with grass. So here's a close-up of the tumulus style. And basically what this is that there would be a grave dug out of the, it's called tufa. It's a kind of volcanic pumice-like rock that is very, very soft until it hits the air and then it hardens. And so the tombs could be carved directly into the rock of the ground, and then the tumulus would be built over it. And so this is, sometimes there's an interior bit of structure, but they're sort of like mounds of dirt that serve to protect, but also locate various tombs. And so again, if we take a look at the way that this place is organized, it's almost like a living city. I mean, there are neighborhoods, there are, as I said, thousands of tombs organized in different methods, and they have streets and sidewalks sort of running between them. So one of the most famous of the tombs is the Regolini Galassi tomb, and this is named not for the people who were in it, but for the people who discovered it in the 19th century, so just be aware. This goes back very, very old, and what you're looking at here is an angle of the dromos. So the dromos is a sort of long square hallway towards the tomb that you would have to walk through to get to the tombs where the bodies are lying or the cremated remains are entombed. And it has a sort of like a fortified ceiling. So these are the corbels that give us this vaulted sense, but it also serves as an antechamber. So you would be in this space before you would approach the actual tomb. So there's a sense of maybe reverence or procession, again, inspiring wonder, because you don't know what's going to be behind that turn. What kind of riches of burial are we going to find there? What kind of majesty of sarcophagus would we find there? So again, this kind of anticipatory sense. So past here, you would be on either side in a tomb. And then here we have a tomb of the shields and chairs. This is quite an interesting structure because, as we've already looked at, there's a sense that the dead are still alive here. So there are 5 separate rooms of tombs in this particular area, 2 that you walk by as you enter into this particular room, and then 3 behind. But what's interesting is that carved straight out of the rock here, we've got shields on the walls and chairs as though people were going to sit down to eat dinner. But we also get a sense that these are duplicating living people's houses because we actually have lintels over the doorways. We've got beams and ceilings, so it's as though they took a house from a contemporary person and put it down here underground for the dead. And so alongside this sense of wonder, the marvels that come with wealthy people's burials. And so this is how we know the society was quite stratified. Some people are buried with very little, and some people are buried with extremely sumptuous wealth. So for example, here on the left, we have a fibula, and this actually comes from that same tomb that we just looked at. And a fibula is like a fancy pin, like a brooch that you would wear for decoration. You could also use it to like keep your cloak on or something like that. And in this particular case, we're seeing a gold one, which is quite rare. Normally they're made out of other metals. I believe bronze is most predominant. And in this case, we can actually see some lions created in repoussé. So if you remember, that means being pushed out from the back, sort of hammered out, like that amulet that we saw with one of the goddesses' faces on it. This interestingly has a hinge, so it could kind of close, and otherwise just exquisitely decorated all around. And then on this other side, we have a very curious structure, the sarcophagus of the spouses. And this sarcophagus, which is made of terracotta, so it would have been clay that had been fired, and you can actually see that it's been put together from separate pieces because such a big piece couldn't fit in the kiln to fire the clay. This is life size. I mean, this is 6 feet long. So this is a huge endeavor, again, representing the wealth of the people for whom it serves, presumably as an urn for cremated remains. Now, you should probably be familiar with faces like this. This is the archaic smile that we've already looked at, for example, on the Poros that we looked at previously. So that like very thin smile with the sides of the mouth turned up, serving to animate the face, right, to give some sort of expression. And in this case, we see something quite lovely. And this piece, I think really speaks to me, and I do feel like I'm marveling at it. I mean, you're seeing a couple in love here. And so the woman in front was probably holding a little bottle that perfume might come out of. The man might have been holding some kind of food, something of the sort in his hand. But you can see from their body expression, the way that they're entwined, that they're together on this banquet couch, which was the tradition of the Etruscans, and then later the Romans, to recline while you eat. But he has his arms around her and she's sort of nestled back into his chest. So in spite of the fact that this is a quite monumental piece, I mean, it's giving us this very intimate look at life here. And it should be noted that Etruscan women had increased privileges compared to their contemporary Greeks. For example, they could own property or keep their own name. So here are some vocabulary terms. And as you're thinking about this material, what I want for your takeaway is to sort of think about how spaces that inspire wonder do something more than just please the eye. They engage with some kind of, whether spiritual or mystical or something larger than the puny lives that people live in the sort of day-to-day mundane kind of world. They bring the spirit up, they bring the heart up, they connect us to divinities that we believe in, and they help us understand our place in the world through the sense of kind of marveling or wondering at them. Thank you.